Hello there, beer nerds. This is the Beer by the Numbers podcast, the only educational podcast that encourages you to consume a beer or two while you listen. I'm your host, Ryan, and the last episode, we started our journey to a great beer education by looking at the three-tiered beer distribution system here in the US today. But I wanted to get a little bit more literal of a focus for a topic this time. And I'm going to focus in on a single object rather than a crazy huge system made up of millions of people and tons of equipment and various things. So today we're going to focus in on the humble beer can. You know, I'm a huge Minnesota Golden Gopher football fan, and I am out there tailgating each and every home game, no matter how cold it gets up here in Minnesota. On the tailgate lot, you can only have canned beer, as no one wants a lot of broken glass lying around or things like that. So while I was out there imbibing a few beers with my buddies, one of those random thoughts that comes into your head every once in a while came to me, and I realized how cool the seemingly inane beer can is. I lean over to my buddy and I say something like, "You ever think about how cool beer cans are? Like, we take this really thin layer of aluminum and we shape it into this cylinder that's easy to hold in your hand, and it takes all the pressure of the gas contained inside that beer and it keeps it safely locked away until we easily crack it open and can sip that delicious fresh beer that has been perfectly preserved in there." And then he looked at me like I was crazy, and we quickly went back to chatting about the game that day. You know, such is the life of a beer nerd. But anyway, canned beer has had a lot of twists and turns throughout its history, going from a revolutionary packaging tool to a symbol of low-class drinking to a resurgence in popularity as craft brewers have embraced it. So today we're going to dive into the history of the beer can and look at the crazy number of cans being used today. Let's crack a can of brew and dive in. For the longest time, brewers only had a few options for packaging beer: bottles, barrels, or kegs. All these were good in their own way, but they had some drawbacks. Bottles were portable and cheap, but they were relatively fragile and couldn't be recycled way back in the early 1900s, so they weren't exactly a great year-in and year-out solution. Kegs and barrels were durable, reusable, and held a large volume of beer at once, but they were pretty expensive and weren't portable for convenient small drinking sessions for your average Joe. Many were looking for a solution that was cheap, a solution that used less material than glass bottles, and was more durable than beer bottles that shattered easily. Just before Prohibition, brewers were seeking to find a way to put beer into metal cans. Now, at this point, canning food had been around for over 100 years, but beer presented a particular challenge for early canning technology. Engineering-wise, canning beer means you need to hold in all that carbonation pressure of the beer contained within. The more beer in the can, the more that pressure builds. At room temperature, a can of beer is holding about 300 kilopascals or 42 pounds per square inch of pressure. For some context on that number, a typical car tire is usually inflated anywhere from 26 to 35 psi and runs the risk of failure around 40 psi or so. So that means a typical can of beer contains more pressure than a car tire. Obviously, in the early days of canning, it was a challenge to create cans that were stronger than car tires, and to do so without having to make really huge and obnoxiously thick cans. This is why beer was one of the last foods to be canned. Early cans were much more expensive than they are today, and they weren't nearly as good as the engineering technology we have today as well. The second big issue for canned beer to catch on was the reality and the perception that a beer's flavor could be ruined by a metal can. What metal you choose to can with is a big deal. Some metals can react with certain flavor compounds in beer. Beer is a really complicated soup of great flavor compounds and textures, but that means it can react with a variety of compounds and metals out and about. In the early days of canning, metal would sometimes make beer taste, well, bad. And brewers also had quite a bit of trial and error to work through to get the sanitation procedures for canning down as well. And even those that canned beer well, such that the beer tasted just as good as it did in the bottle, they had a tough time getting past the bad reputations cans had early in their life cycle. Shortly before the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, the American Can Co. solved these problems with its keg-lined cans. These cans were structurally capable of withstanding the high pressures and were internally sealed with a layer of plastic to prevent the transfer of any metallic taste from the metal can to the beer. Now, these first cans were made out of heavy gauge steel and required a church key opener or other tool to punch a hole in the solid flat top. And that flat top gave these cans their nickname. You'd ask your buddy for a flat top instead of a can of beer. Now, I know the description of the first beer cans doesn't seem like they're really all that different from modern cans, but there's one key part of that description that I just gave that I want to go back to and call out. Those cans were made out of heavy gauge steel. Steel! The same thing you make big girders out of. The first few generations of cans were 10 times heavier than the cans of today. And don't even think about trying to crush one with your forehead or under your foot. That is asking for a lot of pain. The first brewery to take a chance on packaging beer in cans was the Gottfried Krieger Brewing Company of Newark, New Jersey. In November of 1933, Krieger signed an agreement with the American Can Co. to create the first beer cans to go into production. By the end of that year, American Can Co. had installed a temporary canning line and delivered 2,000 cans of Krieger Special beer. These Krieger Special beer cans were filled with a 3.2% beer, the highest alcohol content permitted by law at the time. And thus, beer can history was made. Krieger Special beer became the first canned beer ever produced. Krieger enjoyed a lot of success with canned beer, and by August 1935, Krieger was buying 180,000 cans a day from American Can Co. This regional brewery began claiming a percentage of the market dominated by the three largest brewers at the time, Anheuser-Busch, Pabst, and Schlitz. Pabst had seen enough and introduced its export beer in these flat-top cans in July of 1935. Schlitz quickly followed along as well, but they purchased cans from the Continental Can Company, and these were a little bit different from the flat-top cans that had dominated the marketplace so far. These had a flat bottom and a cone-shaped top, making a nice way to funnel beer straight into your face. Schlitz, Krieger, and Pabst were the earliest adopters of cans, and drinkers loved them. Soon, every medium and large-sized brewery was canning. One of the most interesting cans from the era was the 1/16th barrel can of beer made by the Heakin Brewery. It was only sold in the Cincinnati, Ohio area, and was mostly sent to bars that poured a lot of beer for their customers in a night. I cannot imagine sitting down to a huge 16th barrel can. Sounds like a really interesting challenge to get through, though. Anyway, over the next few decades, the canning companies continued to try to reduce the amount of materials they used in their cans. This was exacerbated by World War II, when metal usage for civilian applications was pretty limited, so it pushed canners to take things to the next level. One of the few good things to actually come out of World War II. The Hawaii Brewing Company introduced the first all-aluminum can in 1958, which was a big step forward in canning technology. But up until this point, all cans required a church key to open, and brewers were looking to make opening cans easier and not require a separate tool. The change that revolutionized beer cans came in 1963, when the Pittsburgh Brewing Company introduced the self-opening beer can. It looked a little bit like today's beer cans. You put your finger in an aluminum ring and you give it a nice pull, and you tear a nice size hole in the top of the can that you can drink through. These new cans were so popular that within 2 years of launch, 75% of cans in the US had been converted to variations on the tearaway self-opening cans. Pull tabs were a beer drinker's dream, but they were also an environmental disaster. Pets and wildlife died from ingesting them, as did more than a few people who dropped them into a can of beer and then accidentally choked on them. They wound up on beaches where children would cut their feet on them, and they littered roadsides and damaged a lot of garbage disposals. Stay tabs were the answer. Introduced in 1975 by the Falls City Brewing Company out of Louisville, Kentucky, they stayed connected to the can after you opened them. Today, virtually all carbonated beverages are marketed in cans with stay tabs. And today's beer cans aren't that much different since the mid-70s. They're a little bit lighter, but we've largely reduced the amount of material needed to contain the pressure of the beer. Most of the innovations we've seen over the last few decades have been dedicated to things that enhance the flavor or the look of beer. Take the Guinness widget, for example. Guinness is a beer that has less dissolved CO2 than many other styles of beer out there, and as such it doesn't produce a signature full head of beer when poured out of a can. Those clever folks at Guinness, though, did come up with a solution. Basically, they took a tiny ping pong ball and stuck it to the bottom of each can with a couple holes in it. When the can is opened, the change in pressure forces beer through these holes and agitates a lot of the CO2 at once, producing that signature head of beer on the Guinness. Another cool innovation happening in beer packaging is augmented reality cans. CrownSmart is an innovative packaging concept that uses scannable QR codes and a smartphone's camera to layer cool, moving images over a white or blank beer can label, allowing users to see cool, interactive, and virtual labels, all while getting a good buzz on. I also found a canning company that is trying to create a reusable crowler can as well. The resealable crowler can is simple to open and reclose with just a quarter turn, says Oscar Blues Brewery, which helped develop the crowler along with the canning company Ball Corporation. Dayton Systems Group, the food and beverage innovator that created the original cap can, was brought in to nail down the resealable technology. The DSG cap has oxygen-absorbing tech in it to try to minimize the amount of oxygen a beer is exposed to, keeping the beer fresher for longer. This will hopefully allow drinkers to reseal their crowlers in the future so that you don't have to drink all 32 ounces or so in one sitting. Of course, it won't be quite as good as a newly fresh can, but it can't be any worse than a growler that you resealed yourself. With all the new canning technology and breweries large and small using cans, you'd think cans would have a pretty good reputation for quality today. But even still, people debate the quality of beer that comes out of cans. I'm going to briefly try to summarize some of the arguments made on both sides, whether you're a can person or a bottle person. But let's just take a quick dive into this debate. When it comes to protecting the beer for the long term, the enemies of beer are light, air, and heat. While you might think that cans would run away with this category because they block 100% of the light going towards a beer, the brown glass used for most beer bottles actually blocks 99+% of light wavelengths, so it's not really a clear win for cans. Where cans really shine, though, is blocking air. Cans form a perfect, airtight seal by their very nature and how they're engineered, and they don't leave any headspace either, so they have a pretty clear edge over bottles when it comes to keeping beer fresh. Unfortunately, the jury's still out as to whether cans are a good storage means for aging beer in something like a bottle cellar. It's not really clear whether or not the slow exposure to light and air has any impact on a finely aged beer, so the jury's still out and we'll have to see if cans can catch up to bottles on this one. Looking at things like weight and portability, cans are lighter, they are less bulky due to the headspace, and they don't produce shards of glass when thrown on the ground. So another pretty solid win for cans. It used to be that a small brewery wouldn't be able to afford a canning line, but with the rise of craft breweries, small-scale canning lines have become much more affordable. Even still, when it comes to affordability for small brewers, bottling is still the way to go. And then there's impact to taste. Some people swear they can taste the difference between canned and bottled beer. Of course, as long as there has been canned beer, people have tried to study whether it's actually possible to taste the difference between the two. I looked at the results of 6 of the most recent studies I could find, and each of them came to a pretty similar conclusion. All of them had around 40 to 60% of participants able to correctly identify a canned beer versus a bottled beer when asked by researchers. So it seems that some people with really sensitive palates or who drink a lot of beer will be able to detect the difference between canned and bottled beer, but most people just aren't really able to tell better than if they were just randomly guessing. But no matter what you think about beer in cans, you really can't deny that they provide an easy and portable way to drink beer. Which is why when I saw that the current US administration was considering a tariff on aluminum, it made me a little nervous. Regardless how you might feel about the current state of international metals trading or international trade in general, any potential tariffs would certainly impact beer prices as canners love cheap aluminum imports. Funny how tariffs always seem to have a lot of unforeseen consequences that you didn't quite consider before it's too late. Anyway, that kind of brings us full circle on beer cans. From the early 1900s to augmented reality to tariffs debates, cans have come a very long way. Thanks so much for joining me for another episode of the Beer by the Numbers podcast. For those of you who aren't familiar with all my Beer by the Numbers YouTube content, I'm really just a nerdy guy who's very, very passionate about a beer, and I want to share that passion with as many people as I can. Oftentimes, beer is looked on as kind of a low-class drink, and although I think the craft beer industry is doing a really great job of shattering that perception, I just want to make sure that beer isn't some fad passing us by. I want to create a great community of excited and passionate beer fans who have a love of learning about beer. If you want to join me in this mission, check the links in the description and head over to the Beer by the Numbers Facebook page. Let me know that you're a listener and I'll be sure to let you in because over there we are building a great community of passionate beer nerds and I'm sure you'll appreciate all the discussion going on. And if you haven't been to the Beer by the Numbers YouTube channel, what in the world are you waiting for? I have like 2 years worth of a back catalog of beer videos and shorter beer essays just for you over there, so you really need to go over and check it out and subscribe if you like what you find. Before I go, it's time for our nightcap numbers related to today's episode number, and for episode number 2, I wanted to look at a few health benefits of beer, as several recent studies have shown that 1 to 2 beers a day can actually be pretty beneficial for you. First things first, for men out there, 1 to 2 beers a day is really good for your heart. Studies show that you reduce the risk of heart disease by 5 to 10% or so just by having a couple beers. So go for it. Another cool health benefit was found for women, as if they typically have a drink or 2 a day, they reduce their risk of a stroke by 15%. Beer can also help strengthen your bones. It delivers some great minerals that are hard to find in other food sources and really helps with bone density. Finally, a moderate amount of beer can help keep your cholesterol levels more even throughout the day and reduces excess bile production, which prevents painful conditions like nasty gallstones. Once again, this has been Ryan with Beer by the Numbers, and I'll see you next time with more great beer content. Cheers.